For this lecture, we're going to talk about peer-reviewed literature. And this is really important for the purpose of research methodologies and being sociologists, because peer-reviewed literature or peer-reviewed research is really kind of the cornerstone of scientific knowledge and dissemination of that knowledge. Now, as we go through the semester, we'll talk a little bit about how that can be honestly a little problematic because access to peer-reviewed literature oftentimes require enrollment in or working for institutions of higher education, and it means that it's not accessible. But we do need to still at least talk about peer-reviewed literature because that is essentially the process in which we will look for literature that is scholarly and is as legitimate as possible to understand kind of what's going on within social phenomenon for us as sociologists. Peer-reviewed literature, though, is not just for sociology or the social sciences, of course. This is where you see a lot of literature and studies published for, for instance, I was able to follow the COVID trials because of peer-reviewed literature. So peer-reviewed literature is used in academics, academia as a whole, and any type of research. So we're going to cover a little bit of what they are and how we can find them, and then I'm going to actually go through the article that is listed in your discussion board for this week so we can understand how to really break it down and understand it. What are scholarly and peer-reviewed articles? So they're not exactly the same. Scholarly articles or scholarly material is something that's legitimate and valid. It's something that's reliable, something that you can follow. There is a lot of overlap within scholarly and peer-reviewed articles, but they're not always the same. For example, a textbook is something that is legitimate and scholarly, but it may not be peer-reviewed. There are some textbooks out there that are, but it may not be peer-reviewed. In this case, peer-reviewed articles are scholarly, and it's the reason that it's scholarly is because these are academic. They are grounded in some sort of research or research-oriented field. So theory is still also an academic and peer-reviewed process, but it's different because it's not something that you would just randomly see on social media, including even like a news source or some sort of academic website that may not be peer-reviewed. Peer reviewed is a little different because one of the key things is that it's actually submitted for publication. You might publish something on a website, but the difference is that peer reviewed is actually published through reputable journals. What sets them apart is that they're reviewed by experts in the field. So if I submit a peer reviewed article, I will submit it as an expert in the field, and then other experts in the field review my submission that I have just submitted for publication, and they're basically reviewing it for validity, to make sure that it's aligned, to make sure that I have an understanding of what the field is, and they make sure that it has been used, that a rigorous research methods or research approach has been used. This is a part of scientific research overall, so again, not just social and behavioral sciences, but research overall within academics, within institutions of higher education, as well as large research organizations. This is a major contribution to academia. So scientific knowledge has oftentimes been generated through institutions of higher education or academia. That does not mean that that's the only place it comes from. There are large, research and think tanks that exist out there. You do not have to be associated with a college in order to submit something. But overall, this does contribute to academia because academia is a part of research. So as as professors, especially if professors are tenure track or tenure, are having to submit to research publications, and it is a contribution to academia overall in the research process. Now, just because it's submitted for publication, even if it's a really good article, it may or may not be accepted. It does not indicate the quality of the article. So let me kind of break this down, that if it's been peer reviewed and accepted for publication, it is likely solid and sound. But just because it's not been accepted doesn't necessarily mean that it's not of high quality or sound. Sometimes it's just not aligned with the journal. But peer review overall does help minimize a lot of the problematic scientific contributions. And what I mean by that is that if it's not sound, it's not rigorous, it's not scientific, that it helps minimize those. It's not without its problems at all. So, for instance, A lot of the dominant rhetoric right now that exists around the overlap of autism and vaccinations, that is highly problematic for so many reasons. First off, there is no scientific grounding or foundation that connects the two. Second of all, it's an incredibly ableist conversation and rhetoric that really minimizes and dehumanizes autistic individuals and people. And then it also calls into question scientific inquiry. Now, again, peer reviewed is not always without its problems, and there was a scientific, and imagine me using air quotes around that, journal that was falsified completely, talking about the overlap and the connection between the two. It has been pulled, it has been debunked over and over again, and it does highlight how unfortunately easy it is to, like, that people can kind of cling to what fits their agenda, because we do unfortunately have a very like anti-science stance as a society, it seems these days. But nonetheless, peer review is still there to help minimize a lot of the problematic ideas that exist, because you do have experts in the field. It has gotten better, not without its problems at all. But nonetheless, it, like I said, it is still there. Now, with peer-reviewed articles, let's talk a little bit about some of the traits and characteristics of peer-reviewed articles that stand out differently than, say, something that you might find online that is still scholarly in nature, but isn't necessarily peer-reviewed. It isn't necessarily a scholarly article like we will be talking about. When I say scholarly, I mean like, a legitimate, valid article. But we're going to talk about peer reviewed. And first off, there's a lot of like formal settings, like formal, if there's a format, we use APA or ASA in sociology, but it can also be used. You could use MLA, you could use Chicago. There's a couple other ones that exist out there. I would say that in the social sciences, you're going to mostly find APA. So this is the formatting that you would see. It's a formal submission. It's not just something that's written on a document without any type of formatting. The authors are scholars in some way. They may not be working for an institution of higher education, but they are scholars and experts in the field, so they do normally have some sort of research background, normally a doctorate degree of some sort, or at least a master's degree. They have expertise in research, though, in the field in some way. Or in sociology, it's also very common to see theorists. They are still using research and empirical research, for that matter, to inform their theory, but nonetheless, like, you still are seeing that they're experts in the field. Additionally, you will see that in journal articles, like, the purpose is to publish research results or theoretical explanations. So it'll be some sort of theory that's explaining social phenomenon, or it's publishing some sort of results or findings from research. There'll also be citations that are in text, footnotes potentially. APA often encourages you to avoid footnotes as much as possible, but you'll see footnotes. And then there's also a works cited or bibliography, normally associated with some sort of school, like an institution of higher education. And I say normally, like the article itself is, and the journal is associated with researchers who are across different schools. Not always, but they are normally associated with some sort of school. You'll also see that there's an abstract. So an abstract is like a summary of what you can expect. There is kind of like formula that goes through it, that you can see. So it introduces what they're talking about, what previous research has said. Like, it's very, very much a very smaller, condensed, summarized version of a research paper. Now, with the organization, this is the general organization of research studies in peer reviewed. So let me break that down, because you can sometimes have conceptual papers, and conceptual papers are ones that are using theory or just introducing a larger concept. Doesn't mean that they've actually conducted research, but they are still using previous research to inform their concept or their conceptual framework. In terms of the organization, though, if it's a research study, you'll see that there's this format where you have the intro, the literature, the methodology, the findings, and the discussion and conclusion. Now, it's really important to think about this, though, in terms of the scientific method. because scientific inquiry basically has you come up with a question or a topic, has you create a hypothesis, has you conduct data collection, has you go and analyze your findings or results, and then you evaluate it. It's key to notice the overlap between that scientific method or the scientific process of inquiry and a research paper. So this idea of an intro is developing the question, is introducing a research question or a research problem. This literature here, if you're doing qualitative research, uh, regardless, the literature informs what you expect to happen, what you can see happening, or what some of the gaps in the literature are, which basically would be like you developing a hypothesis within that scientific process. Methodology is how you collect your data and the data collection process, which is just like collecting data for the third step of the scientific inquiry process. Results or findings in a research paper is where they're talking about did they find, what was the results of their data collection. Same thing with the scientific method, right? And then the discussion conclusion essentially is what happens is you talk about the findings and how it relates to the literature, which is exactly like the scientific process, right? Which is evaluating. You evaluate your findings to your hypothesis or to the previous research that exists. So when you go through and you're looking at these articles, unpacking that, breaking that down is key to understanding really what the process is and how it maintains the scientific inquiry throughout the article as well as the research process. Now, okay. So just thinking about how you find research articles too, the best place to start, there's two places. One would be Google Scholar, and then your school library website. So in this case, right, it would be San Diego State. There's some other resources we can find too. So EBSCO is another good one. JSTOR is one that you've probably heard. I don't use them as much. I normally will go and default to the school library website or Google Scholar. Those are always my go-to. Another thing that you can do though is if you're looking at a piece of literature, like a piece of like an academic peer-reviewed article, you can also look at the bibliographies or the works cited and see what other research they use. That is really that's a really good skill to develop because it can help point you in the right direction to find additional literature. You will be needing to find literature for your research projects that you'll be doing, and so thinking about some of the research that we have and how that might guide your search for academic articles is an important thing to remember. Okay, now I'm going to switch into how to look at a piece of literature. When you open up the class, you will see this, right? And when you, so sorry, not necessarily. So you'll go to modules, right? And you'll see that you have your first, you'll see that you have your first article to analyze. I apologize. Let's see. There you go. Okay. So this is what you would see, right? And this is a peer-reviewed study saying teachers' perspectives on providing support to children after trauma, a qualitative study. So not all of them will tell you what type of research study it is. Not all of them will tell you. So a lot of them will in some way, but this tells you straight up. It is a qualitative research study. So as you go now through, and you look at this, you are going to see that there's an abstract. So first off, it tells you the title. It also tells you the journal up here. Most of them will tell you the journal somewhere on the page. So this is from the School Psychology Quarterly. That is the name of the journal. It tells you what year it was published in 2012. It tells you here which volume, right? Which volume and which number in that volume it is. It also tells you what pages. So if it was a physical copy or has all of them listed next to it down within the same journal with the same volume, it would tell you what pages it's on. This is called the DOI, so that is like an identifier for the journal, so that way you could just look that up and you would be able to find the journal. Newer articles generally have a DOI, much older ones do not have, most likely do not have a DOI. Now with this is the title here. Here is your author, and it tells you where they come from. So this particular researcher and author is coming from these two institutes here. Now you see that there's this, oops, sorry. You'll see that there is an abstract right here. The abstract will give you a breakdown of what is going on, what is the problem, what was their research method approach, what did they find out, and then basically what were some of the themes that came up. So it is a good idea for you to always start with it's a good idea for you to always start with reading the abstract. I always suggest reading the abstract. When you're looking for your own literature, looking at the abstract is going to be also very important because you need to know whether or not you even need to invest the time and energy or not to read the entire article. You'll see some keywords. So these keywords are things that are associated with the research study. So what are some keywords that you can label this article with? So when you're going through, you're going to be able to see all the pieces. Sometimes this is here, it gives like a little bit of a breakdown. It's sometimes you'll see some footnotes. This here is just a random footnote that explains who the author is. You may not see that always. It also tells you what the study was, who was supported by it. Like, so this is helpful for you to find out who funded it. Again, not all articles have that, but this particular one does. As you're going through, you also will see now that this is the introduction. So the introduction does have citations in it. It has some sort of background. So that way you are able to look at what some of the previous research has said. It's different than the literature review because it's really setting the stage. And that's the goal of the introduction. It sets for your for the context of the study. So you go through, sometimes they'll have research questions, sometimes they won't. They'll also sometimes have what's called a problem statement. This particular one, you'll actually does include the introduction and literature together. That I would say is not always the case. But in this particular case, you can see that they do. So they actually have a ton of literature woven throughout. Normally you'll see that there's like a whole separate section for literature. Now, in this, though, they do tell you very explicitly what the aim is. It doesn't have a research question. This is where sometimes, depending on the journal and article, depending on the background, depending on the specialty, will determine a lot of the approach. A lot of it has to do with the journal, though. So they don't have a research question, but a lot of them do. I do often expect that in traditional papers and such, that you have an introduction and a literature. And in the introduction is where you normally see the purpose or aim or research questions. Now, when you're going through this some more, you also can see that they have their method section now. The method section is what is key to understanding the reliability of the study, because it gives the reader an understanding and explanation on what all the steps were that they completed. They talk about how the participants were sampled. They talk about what they were trying to do. They were trying to talk about the goal. So in this case, they were talking about the participants, the people that they were interviewing or working with in their qualitative study. If you go through, and once you read this, you're going to read this on your own, you'll see a wide range of steps. So in this case, they're giving a breakdown and background of the participants. They're also talking about what their data collection tool was. So interviews. So if you were doing observations, for instance, you would have observations instead. And then they also explain how they analyzed it. So I will be talking about analysis in the class. I do not expect you to understand what the analysis portion is, like coding or how you organize data. That's why you're in this class. So don't panic. But we're also going to be reading things regularly so we can understand them. Okay, and then they have the results. Now, I will say in qualitative research, I typically prefer to say findings instead of results. Results is more of a quantitative approach, which we will also be doing for quantitative as well too, right? Because that's what we are doing in this class. We're doing both. But for the results section, this is basically, what were the outcomes? So you'll see that there's subheaders here, and each of these subheaders are basically a theme that they came up with after they did their interviews. You're basically breaking that down and talking about the themes. And they use data that they've collected to support the themes. And the results section, again, is like the analyzed portion of the scientific inquiry. So they go through, they have a lot of different findings. I think perhaps part of the reason they don't have a whole explicit literature is because they actually wanted to focus on just the findings section. You'll notice that there will be a lot of variation across different ones. There's another one for this week
around narrative inquiry that you'll see is a little different. Then they have the discussion in this. You'll see that they talk about the findings of the study and relate it to the literature, which is like the evaluation portion of the scientific method. And this is where you start seeing like how did their findings overlap with previous research, and also it's called implications for future research, which is now what? Now that we have the findings, what else can we learn from this, and what else should we continue to research? And then of course they have their references. You might see it as works cited, you might see it as bibliography or as references. And this is another good place where if you were really interested in the topic, you might want to look at who they used and who they cited in there. So this here, excuse me, I have some guiding questions for you. I had those guiding questions for you that you're going to break down. You are going to write your own reflection. I wanted to make sure that we go through for the first one, at least, in this kind of together setting, so that way you understand how to unpack and read and navigate research journals, and then you're going to use that process in the future for the other reflective pieces. So think about that as we're going forward. Think about, your areas of interest. You can practice and maybe do that. Practice using the school library website and Google Scholar, just looking different articles. Just start practicing with it to get an idea and a feel on how to research that. Things that maybe you don't think you can find literature on, there's definitely literature out there. So practice, messing with the keywords a little differently as well. Think about that as we go forward, and we'll go from there.